What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and my good friend Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man? How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Happy Chinese New Year.
Yes, happy Chinese New Year. It's really funny because I had zero clue it's Chinese New Year until just about
10 seconds before we decided.
A minute ago.
Yeah.
I had zero clue. It's a total coincidence that we're doing this episode on Chinese New Year, or at least releasing it on Chinese New Year. Mm-hmm. We are recording this podcast on Thursday, the 11th or 12th. Or
today is the 11th, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thursday, the 11th in 2021. So we are in the year of the ox, right?
Well, I guess it depends on where in the world we are. I think it's tomorrow, like 12 a.m. It's the year of the ox. But right now as we're recording, we're still in the year of the rat. Although I'm not big into the lunar calendar, so I don't know if they use like a 12 a.m. cutoff or not.
Well, whatever it is, 2021.
It's the year of the ox somewhere.
It's supposed to be the year of the ox, and we're leaving the year of the rat.
Right.
Which makes sense that the year of the rat was the year of COVID because rats spread disease.
Right. They should have renamed it to Year of the Bat, though.
Oh, good point. Is a bat even a zodiac sign or a zodiac symbol?
No, not a Chinese one, at least.
So I have a buddy, and I'll just say I know somebody who they had their baby early. Mm-hmm. They had an induced pregnancy.
Why? Because it wasn't an auspicious date?
To avoid having their child be born in the year of the rat.
That's hilarious.
So the child was induced and came out in, I think, January or December before the Chinese New Year. So
are they Chinese or Asian generally?
They're Vietnamese.
Okay, yeah, I think that there's like a lot of those cultures. They have a lot of traditions around numerology, and I know that specifically the Chinese, like they look for auspicious symbols, in dates. So like there's, specific dates that you should get married, specific dates that you should, have babies, different years and like different meanings. It's all very, horoscopy in my opinion, but it's definitely a part of the collective Asian culture for sure. It's a big part, yeah.
Yeah, but inducing the child, so what? I guess
different strokes for different folks, As long as the baby is healthy and the mother is healthy, I have no problem with that. That's their choice.
Yeah, I mean it's whatever floats your boat. Now, do you want to get started right into the episode, or do you want to?
Well, I do have one update, one thing, and I promise then we'll jump right back into the actual show here. But as you know, I am a #Free Britney kind of guy, and the show that I told everybody about last weekend came out on Hulu last weekend. It was called Framing Britney Spears, and I watched it, and it was awesome. And it was a piece that the New York Times did. It was very, very good. So I recommend it for anyone who might be interested in this particular story. And the short version of the story is that, basically she's been under what's called a conservatorship by her father. They say that she has dementia and she can't control herself. But it's total bullshit because she's able to put out albums and do tours and have residencies in Las Vegas. And she's totally cohesive and it's all a lie. Anyway, so about this, I found out today, just about an hour before we started recording, that after this show came out, I guess she's getting some notoriety, and finally the judge bent a little bit. So now Jamie Spears, her father, not her sister, who carries the same first name, has to be the co-conspirator. No, not co-conspirator. What was the word? Conservator. He has to be the co-conservator with a bank called Bessemer Trust. So now he doesn't have exclusive access to all her money. He has to work with this third party, which is a really, really good sign, because now he can't embezzle the shit out of her. And also what's fucked up about this whole thing is that Britney Spears is paying for everyone's legal fees, right? She's paying for her own to get her freedom, and then she's also paying for her dad's to fight against it, and it's really fucked up situation. So, some good news coming out of the Free Britney saga.
Well, that's what happens with these child stars. They're especially if they have greedy parents.
Yep.
Their life later turns into a humongous train wreck fighting over money.
Yep. It's unfortunate.
But yeah, I guess it's good that things are turning positive for her. Now let's jump into the topic, because after our last episode, over the past few weeks, we've been concentrating on China. Specifically, we jumped into the Uyghurs last episode, and what ended up happening is that Danny fell into a really big rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah.
And why don't you tell us about this rabbit hole that you fell in and what we want to do the podcast on today?
For sure. So initially, as you pointed out, we did this, kind of full topic on the Uyghurs. We had talked about this like a year and a half ago or so, kind of in passing as part of a show, but not a full show. And then we did all of this research to just talk about the Uyghurs because it's gaining a lot of popularity in terms of the media that we're getting about it. As you know, Mike Pompeo on the last day of the Trump administration threw the hand grenade out into the room that said, that the U.S. is labeling China's treatment of the Uyghurs as a genocide, which is huge news, right? That's huge geopolitical news, right? So we wanted to cover all right, well, what's the history of the Uyghurs and what's going on and stuff like that. So we did that episode, and that got me super fascinated in wanting to understand, okay, sounds like these minorities don't like these minorities, and what's going on here, right? What's with this ethnic divide, right? The sectarian divide. So I wanted to explore that, and I wanted to know, well, what is the ethnic makeup? What is the ethnic, comeuppance of the Chinese nation? What is this? Because something that I found out from the last episode was that there's 56 ethnicities in China, right? It's not just one Chinese people, even though the Chinese Communist Party likes to pretend that that's the case. And so I went on this fucking rabbit hole. Initially I wanted to do a historical episode, which I still kind of do, that talked about the warring states of China, right? To try to help us understand the context by which we got to, a massive Chinese, Communist Party. But then I found out, and I found a particularly good article, an essay written by a professor of anthropology that kind of blew my mind. And it was about basically the invention of the Chinese people. And then that was the rabbit hole that I fell down. So I pretty much wanted to kind of explore the concept of a Chinese nation and how that refers to the billions of people within that geographic territory of China, which, like I said, includes more than 50 ethnicities. And I think what's important to point out is that labeling and using the word Chinese nation in this way is not exactly appropriate, because there is a difference between a state nation and an ethnicity. They're related, but they're different. We'll talk more about that later.
But let's actually lay out some definitions before we proceed.
Sounds
so good. An ethnic group is a group of people who identify with each other based on a common set of language or history or culture. People who identify as a group, and more importantly, that other groups identify as a group as well.
Right.
Examples of ethnic groups are the Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, etc. There's many ethnic groups in the world, and at some point, these groups were something else, or were a combination of different ethnic groups at the time.
Right.
For example, no one really spoke Polish until the Middle Ages.
I didn't know that.
People, it wasn't an ancient language. It was a language that started appearing around the 10th or 11th century. The Poles were Slavs. They were descendants of the West Slavs. And they basically assimilated. I don't know the full history of the Polish ethnicity, but kind of like a spark notes is that all these clans assimilated in this one region, and they created Polish people. Now, the difference between a state and an ethnic group is that a state is a political construct that holds a monopoly of violence over a defined area. A nation state is a political identity whose citizens hold a common language or ancestry or history. And nation states, take note, they're a new phenomena. Mm-hmm. There weren't that many nation states 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. Nation states really started appearing like in the 17th century, 18th century with France and England and Spain. And I think what's the most important thing to really identify before we jump into this is that ethnicity can sometimes be a political construct rather than something that is organic.
Yeah, absolutely. And as it relates to China specifically, as a nation or a nation state in and of itself, I think the Chinese nation has been, 100 years or so old, but it's not a very old thing in and of itself. What we know is China basically emerged through confrontations between China and Western powers over the last 100 years. And, but as a national like entity of consciousness, I'm quoting here from the source that we'll be using. I think that it has like a 5,000 year formation, right? So depending on how you measure it or what you want to call it, it's either 5,000 years old or 100 years old.
And what's important about the modern context is that over the past 100 years, China was forced to band together when confronted by powerful nation states that could divide and conquer it. Mm-hmm. So first the Europeans and then later the Japanese. Mm-hmm. The CCP was a nationalist movement in addition to being a communist movement. In fact, the CCP held more legitimacy as a nationalist movement than a Chinese Nationalist Party, who a lot of people saw as just kind of like puppets of Western governments. So it's an interesting way to look at the Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s. Like they were... they could be seen as a Chinese nationalist group, even though like within communism, usually they're dividing people by ethnic, it's all about the class struggle, not like the ethnic divide.
Yeah, totally. And I think what's interesting about China specifically is that you could probably do a whole 6-week ancient history series on the dynasties during the warring periods.
Oh, you could do like
it would be like a long fucking
a PhD on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let alone 6-week ancient history.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally one of the longest lasting, like peoples, if we want to use that term loosely. But for today, we're not gonna dive into every like little dynasty and every single warring period. What we're gonna do is a general overview of the formation of the Chinese nation. And how its multi-ethnic nature basically formed this unified people that we call Chinese today. And if we have some time, maybe we can also talk about how it plays into the current situation with the Uyghurs as an ethnic minority. But one thread that I think we're going to follow pretty consistently here through the formation of the Chinese nation is that we're going to see a consistent pattern of unifying like multiple distinct ethnic groups, sometimes through assimilation, like through willing assimilation, and other times it'll be through domination. But in pretty much every instance of unification that we see, there's going to be these disparate peoples that create something new, and by creating something new, it basically means the extinction of something old, of an older, previous, unique ethnicity. So that's one of the threads that you're going to hear a lot. But so I want to talk about the source here because I want to give credit to the professor here. The journal, the essay that he writes is called "The Formation and Development of the Chinese Nation with Multi-Ethnic Groups." The author is named Xiaotong Fei. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology at Peking University in Beijing, China. And this essay is kind of old. It was based on a lecture that he gave back in 88. So when I was born, in the year of the dragon, whoop whoop, at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I think one thing to point out is that while it is very old, especially because a lot of things have changed since 88 in China, I think a lot of things are true, and he really hits the nail on the head when it comes to the formation of the Chinese people. So there are also places where I disagree with him, and where I think he's toting a communist line.
Well, what's interesting though is that this was written in the 1980s, and in the 80s, a lot of these ancient sites were being found.
Exactly. Yeah.
That proved the existence. So this was like hot off, like a really a lot of this writing that Zhi Tongfi did was in response to a lot of these archaeological digs where they found proof of dynasties that they thought were just myth.
Right. The Shah dynasty specifically.
The Shah dynasty specifically. Everyone thought it was a myth.
Right.
Future dynasties would say it was a myth because they lost their legitimacy due to their corruption and things like that. But they found out that no, these guys are actually a society. They had there's dig sites. They were things. So they were kind of a real people, and that extends the history and the civilized history in that region, to the third millennia,
right? BC,
BC,
right? So like a long fucking time ago, and I think that formation of that multi-ethnic structure, like we were saying, it's 3,000 years ago, and I think basically the region that we want to look at here, like if you were to pick this is where it started, would be in this plateau, what's called the middle region of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers.
So just like ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt, these were civilizations that were formed near the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Nile River. These nations, the Chinese civilization, same thing. They developed near a river.
Right. And I think that's true for pretty much every ancient, thing. The presence of water is important for a civilization. So I think that one thing I want to point out is that Chinese people didn't just pop up out of nowhere, right? It took like a super long time for them to become what we know today as Chinese people. It was like what Professor Face calls like a snowball effect, which basically took 3,000 years to move. And I think it's also important to look at the geography of the quote Chinese homeland to kind of understand how that nation formed. So the boundaries of what we would consider China today, and I'm using air quotes here, I know you can't see it, but China, it's basically marked by these geographic boundaries, right? So on the west side, we have a plateau, the Pamir Plateau, and a mountain range in that area as well. In the east, we have the ocean and the islands of the Pacific. In the north, there's a desert, the Gobi Desert, and in the southeast, we have the South China Sea, and in the southwest, we have a mountain range, which separates it from Southeast Asia.
You have the Himalaya mountains. You have the largest mountain ranges in the world.
Exactly. And so I think from the perspective of ancients, what I learned here is that this region was basically the entire habitable region where humans could live. If you were an ancient person living in this area, that was the world for you. And they also believed that basically they were surrounded on all four sides by the ocean. They called it like within the four seas, which is obviously not true, but that's just what they believed. And it's because of those natural boundaries, right, that it created this, what do we want to call it? Like a little microbiome, even though this region is fucking massive, right? This region is like the size of the United States. So really, really, really huge area, but because of all these natural structures, we have a very enclosed unit. Also important to note, geographically speaking, is that the whole region slopes downwards from west to east. So it starts at an altitude of like 4,000 meters above sea level in the Hengduan Mountains, and it continues pretty gradually for thousands of miles until you get to like the plains and the foothills in the east that aren't very far above sea level at all. And what this does, like ecologically, is it creates this huge climate diversity. So you'll see, areas that are, rainforests, you'll see mountainous regions, you'll see, as I pointed out, deserts, you'll see plains, all kinds of different things happen because of this change in altitude and in gradation. And so what you also see is in places with fertile land and temperate climates, you get societies that form around things like agriculture, right? If you can grow crop and the temperature is okay and the soil is good, that's what people did there. But you also have these areas where it's grassland and steppes. And in those areas, you'll get a lot of animal husbandry. So people raising cattle, people raising sheep, people raising horses, because that's what was good to do there. And, basically, if you lived in the mountains, it meant something totally different than if you lived in the desert. And that is absolutely reflected in the types of ethnicities and the cultures that they had that sprung up in those respective regions.
And if you listen to our episodes we did on Egypt as well as ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, this region that we're talking about right now is way bigger than the Fertile Crescent or way bigger than the Nile River Valley. It's also it's contained by natural boundaries as opposed to Mesopotamia, for example, that really didn't have any natural boundaries at all. That's why a lot of the civilizations that came out there were warrior type cultures because they had to defend themselves. So this is important because although there were times of conflict with outside entities throughout the history of China, the history of conflict in this region is primarily a history of infighting of the different ethnic groups that developed there.
Right, exactly. And I've got a good quote that kind of helps, bring that to the fore. So Professor Fay says, all nations have a set of claims about their origins, and these claims are used to support the feelings of national identity. As a result, there can be differences between these claims and the historical facts. And I think this is kind of a good point for us to talk a little bit about, like, how do we know the things that we know about a potentially 5,000-year-old civilization, right?
You gotta,
yeah.
It's a lot like Plutarch and a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman historians. They were historians. I think that they probably took the more of the scientific approach at that time to studying history. But again, they were highly biased sources. A lot of the stories that were passed down in Greek society were oral stories. Mm-hmm. So a lot
written
of them
hundreds of years later,
meant to be performed in front of people.
Right.
So you never really know what was true or what was not true.
Right. But to Henry's point early on, when we were talking about the archaeological digs and the excavations and the findings that we were learning in the 80s, there is some archaeological evidence to back up some of these texts. So I think we can say that the texts that we focus on, and these are primarily texts written down by Confucius, are mostly true or mostly reliable. At least it's a good starting point. On specifically those fossils, what we start seeing are these early fossil records of early human ancestor species, so things like Homo erectus. So this is like the precursors to Homo sapiens, which is what we are now. And they find this all over the place in China. And this suggests that the cultures that emerged in China emerged there organically rather than through migration. Obviously, all human species, they were a product of migration from Africa. That is pretty well documented. But what I'm suggesting is that we're talking about these really early proto-human beings were already in China at the stage of Homo erectus, as opposed to places like Japan, as an example, that don't have Homo erectus there, right? They migrated from China through a land bridge that used to exist between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. Right, so they were there a long fucking time. They have these fossils that were found of the Yuanmo people, and that was dated to about 1.7 million years ago. And they found those in Yunnan, in the county of Yunnan. And there's also plenty of fossils that were found that date 100,000 or more years ago, all over the place, all over China, in all of the different regions. Another quote that Professor Fay had wrote that I totally agree with is that it's difficult to imagine that in that primitive age, people so dispersed in all directions shared the same origin, and it is certain that these long separated populations had to develop their own unique cultures to accommodate such diverse natural environments. So by now, I'm hoping that you're getting the sense that that there's basically a natural geographic region where Chinese cultures were born, that there is fossil records that suggest that they've been there for a minute, and that the fossils are pretty much everywhere, so it's not like just one here and there, and that the entire region has very distinct ecologies which promoted different types of cultures, right? Old as dirt people, lots of different regions, lots of different unique cultures sprung out of this big fucking area. Make sense?
It makes sense to me.
Definitely. I've got two quotes here, and they're kind of long, so if they get a little too long, I'll edit them down a bit. But here's the one. According to the archaeological findings, the similar ecological conditions of the central plains between the mid and lower reaches of the two rivers during the Neolithic era described above explained the dawn of the Chinese civilization in the 3,000 years between 5,000 and 2000 BCE, when the ancestors of the Chinese nation were still scattered in various regions. In these separate regions, they established their own unique cultures, and from this, we can see the starting point of the structure of the unified multi-ethnic nation. In the midst of multiple structuring emerged a system of competition in which more advanced cultures were absorbed by less advanced cultures, while maintaining their own characteristics through contact. For example, eventually the Yangshao culture in the mid-Yellow River region began to infiltrate the upper Yellow River region in the west. However, when the Yangshao culture came into contact with the superior Shandong Longshan culture, the lower Yellow River, there emerged its successor, the Henan Longshan culture. Archaeologists add the regional names in front of the Longshan culture to indicate that they still emerged from the native cultures and describe the real process of intercultural exchange among different groups. As a result, a single cultural structure came out of a multiplicity. Okay, that was a bit of a mouthful. Let me unpack that for a second. Basically, what he's writing is that we have all of these various different unique cultures, and eventually they start growing and having contact with one another. In the one example he points out, we have this Yangshao culture, and they end up bumping into this other culture called the Shandong culture, which apparently was superior to them. And rather than the first culture just assimilating into the second culture, the two cultures fuse together to make something completely different. Does that track well for you, Henry? Are you following that?
So it sounds a lot like how the Danes and the French, or the Franks, they weren't the French at this time,
right?
They combined to create the Normans in northern France.
Right.
So the Viking raiders from Denmark and the native Franks, they made this Norman culture that went ahead and then conquered.
Right. And you could
England.
Yeah, you could probably make a case that maybe the Franks were culturally superior. This is where I get a little bit weirded out by the way that Professor Fay writes, because he talks about superiority a lot. You could like say that like the Franks were superior to the fucking Vikings then, or vice versa. But when they came together, they created something different, right? It wasn't like, I'm just going to grab all these, all of your people and you're now me. It just became something new.
I think what he's referring to as a more advanced culture is just more advanced culture. They probably just had more technological they had better technology and they had maybe a more developed language system. I mean, who knows? Who could really know that? But I don't think he means it as in like a DNA sense, like a genetic superiority.
Yeah, definitely not in that respect. I just get a little weirded out when he says things like that. It triggers me a little bit. Maybe that's just a liberal in me.
But I guess the point what he was making is that just because a civilization is more advanced doesn't mean that you can't degrade and assimilate into a culture that's less advanced.
Right. Or that you would maintain your culture after you know bumping into a lesser culture, you know. Yeah.
But this kind of reminds me of, well, it doesn't really remind me. I want to ask how this compares to how civilizations rose in Mesopotamia, because the most common theory is the challenge response theory. The challenge response theory is people were forced to band together to build levees and irrigation systems because of all the frequent and unpredictable flooding that went on.
Right.
Because of the Euphrates River would flood all the time, and it would flood unpredictably. Like it would just flood whatever. So people had to kind of use their brains and work together in order to build these irrigation systems to stop, you know, their crops all being destroyed. And eventually this led to the introduction of like cities, and then eventually political systems, and then armies, and you know, that's how Western civilization really began.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a huge comparisons and some contrasts. I think the first place that I'll start is that in this article, and just generally in the Chinese diaspora, if you will, there's this attempt to make this massive region that we consider the entire massive region as one thing, right? And I think that is true in a certain sense, but it doesn't allow for a lot of nuance. So what I would say is that if you look at individual cultures that sprang up along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, there's absolutely a challenge response theory going on there for how those civilizations sprung up. Both of those river systems are very highly prone to flooding, and also that whole region is very fertile, which is why they have agriculture. So they absolutely had to develop technology to create levees and irrigation systems, as he pointed out. So that created communities in and of itself. It also is important to note that unlike in Mesopotamia, where it was basically a marchland, right, where people would go through because there was no natural boundaries, there is a natural boundary in all of China, but within China, it's pretty open, right? And so it was less about, hey, the Egyptians are encroaching on the Fertile Crescent. It was more about, hey, the West Yellow River guys are encroaching on the East Yellow River guys, right? And so they also had this system of competition between one another, and they would often fight with one another, militarily, and like I pointed out before, when they started bumping into each other, it wasn't always the case that the more advanced or the militarily superior culture maintained its culture. Usually they got together and they made a new thing. That's usually what happened.
What's interesting though is that in Chinese mythology, a lot of their ancient leaders and a lot of their ancient idols were people who were I forget the name of him. It's like Yu or something. I forget.
Yu is one of them. Yes.
Yu. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yu is one of them. He was able to placate the floods, or he's able to figure out how to deal with the floods, and that's how he became a legendary hero. In between the late 3rd century BC, so 2100, 2200, there was massive flooding going on in China, just massive flooding. And these leaders emerged because they had the wit to invent stuff to stop floods from happening.
Yeah, and I don't know how this relates, but I know that when we were talking about Mesopotamia, a lot of these guys or rather not Mesopotamia, but in the Nile River, right? They would set up a religion around the river itself, right? And the fact that they were able to predictably show, oh, it's going to flood, it's going to not flood, it's going to flood, it's going to not flood. That gave the monarchy, the pharaohs, power, right? That gave them their legitimacy. And when it didn't work out, that's when they got torn up. What I don't know about these ancient Chinese dynasties is whether or not they developed a almost like a theological monarchy or not. I don't know if they were worshiping a god or gods in general, and I don't know if they're if they were utilizing that as a leveraging point against their people or to leverage their power upon the people. What I do know is that they had this thing called the Mandate of Heaven, right, to help them legitimize their control. And whenever you've lost the Mandate of Heaven was when we would see these dynasties change hands. And maybe it might make sense to just do a really brief overview of some of these dynasties, because I think they're important to talk about this multi-ethnic nation. I'm not going to go into a deep dive because honestly, we can do whole entire week's worth of episodes on just any one of these dynasties. But the general idea is this.
Let me take a stab at these dynasties.
Go for it.
You correct me. So I think there's the Xi.
The Shah.
The Shah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can't.
It's pronounced. Yeah, they're hard, man.
The thing about pronouncing words is that people make fun of me for mispronouncing a lot of stuff. I don't have the opportunity to talk about a lot of these words
outside of this,
outside of reading about it, and then finally, when I finally talk about something, I'm mispronouncing it as I'm reading it, I'm reading it incorrectly. But there's the Shah, the Jia, the Shang, and then there's Zhao. Right? Those are the three first ones, and then the Jia is like the ancient one where they recently found evidence in the 1980s, kind of like this paper was in response of finding the evidence of the Jia civilization.
Yeah, totally.
The Shangs were the people that took over afterwards. Mm-hmm. And then the Zhao kind of was a weird situation because it would break up and then it would decentralize, and then it would have like a feudal system, and then it would regain centralized power.
Right.
And the structure, like the Zhao dynasty, was when like the warring state periods happened.
Right, exactly.
And like a lot of those civil wars in those areas took place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, totally. And those are all, by the way, rooted and fundamentally in those Yellow and Yangtze River regions. And then there's this spring and autumn period, which is kind of like a unification, and then a warring state period, which is another, division period. All of this happens like kind of back and forth a couple of times until, and I think that one of the bigger turning points in this dynastic periods of ancient China is when Emperor Qin Shi Huang unified the entire plateau. And his expansion of that, like, I guess you could probably, liken him to kind of like, oh shit, what's the Akkadian guy's name? Yeah, Sargon of Akkad. Thank you. You can liken him to kind of like Sargon of Akkad. His expansion of the region and unification was amazing. He was also a fucking dick. Like, I think I would like to actually talk, do an entire episode on just the Qin dynasty, because there's so many like positive things and also so many negative things about him. Like one positive thing, he unified the language.
You're a dick.
He was
Emperor Qin, you're a dick.
He was brutal. He was fucking brutal. But he also, brought a lot of people together, and he made a lot of prosperity. And he laid the groundwork for China. Right? Like, there's a reason why we call it China. It's this guy. Qin, China. Qin. That's where it comes from. So, this guy's super important. Maybe we'll do another episode on him in the future.
Do you know what they say about making omelets?
You got to crack a few chins?
You have to break, you have to crack a few chins.
Yeah.
To make an omelet.
A Chinese omelet. So, where were we? So basically, this is like 2,000 years ago. And today, China is more than 1.4 billion people. And that's according to a 2010 census. I think that there's a 91% percent of the population is what we consider Han Chinese, and we'll use this word a bit more as we go along. And about almost 9% of them were minorities. So I think here it might make sense for me to talk a little bit about the Han people. So the Han people are this ethnic group that persisted today. The Han Han Dynasty came after the Qin Dynasty, and it basically kept furthering the expansion and unification of China. And right today, we consider them a unified like ethnic group, but realistically, they were a amalgamation, like a bunch of different ethnic groups that came together under these empires, right, under these dynasties. And they mostly lived in agricultural areas of China. And it could be said that they inhabited all of the areas that were suitable for agriculture in this area that we know as the Chinese homeland, the one that I was talking about with the natural boundaries. And in this way, what we started noticing is that the regions where we had that we today see the majority of our ethnic minorities, what we can, people like Uyghurs, Tibetans, things like that, Huis, the areas that those people live in were in the areas that were less suitable for agriculture. So we see a consolidation in the agricultural rich areas to Han, and we see a more diverse set of ethnic groups in like mountainous regions. And what happens is the Han would, I'm using his words here, Professor Faye's here, they basically infiltrated the ethnic minority areas and formed this like network of Han Chinese outposts within non-agricultural areas, like in Xinjiang, as an example, where the Uyghurs are. And this network of a core of Han in the east with a couple of outcroppings of Han establishments in the west, that became the structure that we today know as the unified multi-ethnic nation of China.
And there's a lot of modern multi-ethnic states in the world. Like, look at Indonesia. Like, Indonesia has like 600 different ethnic groups there. Mm-hmm. Malaysia, they have 3 major groups. They have the Malays, they have Indians, and they have Chinese people. They have a really big Chinese diaspora. Mm-hmm. And not to mention, Malaysia is probably one of the most racist places on earth, because I guess Chinese people are seen as an ethnic group outside of China. Mm-hmm. Like they're seen as their own Chinese diaspora. Yep. In Malaysia, it's very, 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 very hard on Chinese people there. There's a lot of discrimination there. Pretty much every country in Africa has dozens of ethnic groups in each state. Look at Ethiopia. We recently just did a podcast on the war, the civil war that's breaking out in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. That was a product of their ethnic federal system, where they had different ethnic groups governing different parts of the country, but they would compete for the centralized power. And now there's a huge civil war between the Tigray in the north and the rest of the country.
Right. Very interesting episode, by the way.
If you look at European states, or at least Western European states, and this is, I guess you could say this is opinion, but they formed through civic nationalism. And even though that they were formed through civic nationalism, there was still this process of eliminating other culture identities, because to create a nation state, there needs to be this process of indoctrinating everyone, indoctrinating the population. So making sure that everyone speaks the same language, making sure that people have the same culture icons, making sure that people, they pledge allegiance to the same flag, making sure that people like the same movies. I mean, it gets people acting like smart people who live in the urban areas, like these smart, like kind of elite, elitist type figures who live in these urban areas where the state structures exist. They formulate plans to spread this, whatever culture they're trying to promulgate to, the countryside, to the farmlands,
right?
To these different parts of the country. So, because a lot of groups, if you go back thousands of years, or not even thousands of years, if you went back 500 years, there was probably more of a village identity rather than some large, national identity. There was probably some identity over some, 50-mile area of like 20 miles or so than this national identity.
Right.
And then in the process of creating nation states now, look at France, for example, they had to eliminate all the other ethnic groups that were living in France at the time. And then you had a lot of them. You had the Flemish. Who speaks Flemish nowadays?
Very few.
You had Bretons. They were destroyed along with all the other ethnic groups. So, I mean, to create a nation state is a messy process, and that's what China's doing right now when it's creating their nation state in broad daylight per se, but they're trying to keep it secret, so it makes it look worse. But that's what they're doing with them re-educating Uyghur Muslims in the Northwest.
Yeah,
they're trying to do that.
I definitely struggle with this because, it's easy to look back on the past and look at like the 3,000 years ago state where, they were assimilating smaller ancient peoples and basically eradicating those, unique identities to create one Han person. But, today that's happening also, right? The Han is this core of the Chinese multi-ethnic nation, but the Han are also a historic, like hodgepodge of a bunch of ancient ethnicities that share a, I guess, cohesive culture today. Even that's a stretch, because even of the people that consider themselves Han, they have very different, cultures, even within itself, like even different languages, right? One thing that's notable is the difference between Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese, right? That's a huge difference. But nevertheless, we've got this like group of what used to be a bunch of ethnicities that are forcing these other minorities who are considered other to them, even though them is in and of itself a multi-ethnic group, to be like them. It's just kind of confusing, And when you see it happening in broad daylight, like you said with the Uyghurs, and then when you also consider that this is all like under the umbrella of the Chinese Communist Party, where they're all like, we are one people, but also we are many people, but we are one people. I struggle with it. It's hard to wrap your head around, and I think, honestly, if I'm being honest, it kind of feels a lot like, the American nationality, we are a multi-ethnic peoples, but we are like a one thing. I don't know. I'm getting off track here.
Well, I think that one thing is more, it's more of, I don't think you're going where there's like this Han supremacist movement there that's trying to like assimilate.
I honestly do think there is a bit of a Han supremacist movement going on there. They're very like, there's some clear cut racism from the research that I've been doing for the Uyghur issue. For sure, there is a Han supremacist theory.
But is the prejudice just limited to the Uyghur population? I guess there's
it's not. It's
the
just
Uyghurs
Han
aren't,
and
the Uyghurs
non-Han.
aren't the Muslims. The Uyghurs aren't the only Muslims in China.
Right. No, there's also the Hui, right?
Yeah.
But it is a Han versus non-Han thing, right? And that's where this idea of like Han supremacy comes from,
Han's 91% of the population,
right? But also we're talking about Han as if Han is one thing. Han is many things, like it's crazy to me.
It's all ethnicities are constructs.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
They're all fleeting too.
Mm-hmm. And they all change.
Ethnicity, they all change and they all assimilate into something else.
Mm-hmm.
There's no like Roman. There's no one speaking Latin. anymore.
Yeah. No.
Even
not by
if
choice.
even if you take the an interesting way to look at the evolution of English is looking at the Lord's Prayer. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, totally.
The Lord,
and
the
like
Lord's
how it has changed.
How it has changed.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And this was all taken from, I think this goes back to the 1400s.
Right, which grand scheme of things isn't even that far away.
Which is not that far away. In the 1400s, you couldn't even tell. You could barely tell it was English.
Right.
That's how much English has changed.
Right.
You could barely tell. So imagine what England was like 800 years ago.
Imagine what China was like 3,000 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, it's nuts. It's nuts. It's totally crazy. And maybe it might make sense to talk about like what's the current ethnic makeup of China, because we're kind of touching on it a little bit. And I think there are these ethnic minority territories, and if you look at it by land area, ethnic minority territories account for more than half of the country. Right? It's mostly ethnic minority territory. And we're talking about like mostly plateaus, mountains, grasslands, stuff that wasn't typically suitable for agriculture in the ancient Neolithic period. But as a result, what we see is ethnic minorities, when they came up in these regions, they did animal husbandry, right? They did fucking
Were they
sheep.
married animals?
No,
I'm just joking. It just kind of sounds like that a little bit.
It does. It's like you raise sheep and you raise cattle and you like ride horses and
I know.
Maybe some of them have hawks and shit. Like cool shit.
If I was in school though, if I was like a 7th grader in school listening in social studies, if someone said animal husbandry, I'd be like, animal husbandry, marrying animals.
I'm husbanding my animals. Yeah, but I mean, but that's the type of economy that they developed. They developed an economy that was centered around animal husbandry. But the Han people, who lived in the fertile areas that agriculture can happen, they situated an economy around agriculture. And I think it's obviously clear that the agricultural economy wins out, right? Or at least it won out historically, because you see a very rapid expansion of the Han and not a very rapid expansion of these other minority groups. And this is evidenced by the population. Like even though half of the land area is minority territory, even inside of the minority territory, we see a pretty big Han population. They may even be a majority in certain cases. So there are 8 provinces, actually, that ethnic minorities occupy more than 10% of the local population. So that's Inner Mongolia, Guizhou, Yunnan, Ningxia, Guangxi, Qinghai, Xinjiang, which is the one with the Uyghurs, and Tibet, which is interesting that they write Tibet in here because this was in the 80s when Tibet was still definitely a part of China, and now it's like questionable whether or not it should be or not. It's like the whole Taiwan question, like, is Taiwan a part of it? He actually goes to say that they didn't have statistics on the population in Taiwan, so he left them out intentionally, but he definitely said that Taiwan is a part of China. So, this is one of those like toting the Chinese communist line parts of the essay that I was just like, whatever, rolling my eyes.
Can you really blame him though?
No, I can't, because he probably would have gotten in trouble if he didn't say something like that. So,
because this guy was not some like Chinese propagandist.
No, he's not
Chinese.
a shill.
He was a real anthropologist who would,
a good one too.
Lectures in Oxford and come to America. Right. Like he was a renowned anthropologist.
He's a very good one.
Leading expert in Chinese anthropology.
It's just funny to see, like, because you could clearly see where it's like, oh, there goes the Chinese, the Communist Party line again. You just see where they popped in. Like, it's almost like he wrote them in there in such a way to be like, I have to say this. Here it is. It was just interesting to have that.
Well, someone probably looked at it.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, like someone's like, okay, let's read this.
We're gonna add this line here.
This line, that line.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So back to the ethnic population. So ethnic minority populations, more than half of the total population in only 2 ethnic minority autonomous regions. Those 2 are Xinjiang and Tibet. And so even in these giant regions, which we would consider as an ethnic minority region, there are probably mostly Han people living there because there's just so many fucking Han people, right? Like almost a billion Han people by themselves. And so because of this, it makes it very hard for us to find a pure, quote unquote, ethnic minority community because, in a lot of these regions, we see a mixed bag, right? We see communities where minorities live separately from Han. We see communities where they live alongside of them and everything in between, right? But in Tibet and Xinjiang, there is more clear separation of those peoples, which I think is why we have such... I mean, we haven't really talked about Tibet in general, but, the issues with Tibet are very similar in that respect to the issues with Xinjiang. These are very distinct, unique ethnic groups, and they don't want to assimilate with the Han. Like, they want to be their own thing, and that causes some tension.
Xinjiang is Uyghur territory.
Yeah, Xinjiang.
For those of you who haven't listened to our last episode.
Exactly. Here's another quote. It's a short one here. Han peoples have also been absorbed by local ethnic groups. However, the Han rely primarily on those who deeply penetrate the ethnic minority areas, exerting their ability to form cohesion, consolidating all of the ethnicities into a unity. Which is interesting.
So what does that mean? Like the unity that the Han exert?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this one a little bit, but it sounds like that Professor Fay is trying to say like the Han possess some kind of unifying quality, right? Which I think on the face of it sounds really good. Like he's trying to make the Han sound like this like the unifier, right? Like China is one because the Han unifies all these disparate peoples, and that's a really cute thing to say. Taken from that perspective, I think, and totally out of context, you would probably praise the Han for doing this work, and to a certain extent, I agree with this, right? But that might have even just been the original intention. I think if you look at some of the founding documents of the Chinese Communist Party, it suggests that they want to create unity among disparate ethnic groups. But if you look at the reality of it today, and we're also judging Professor Fay on more than 30 years of 30 years later, so we have to take this with a grain of salt. But I think if you look at the reality today, that the unity that he's talking about is totally a forced unity, where we have like a minority culture that's suppressed and basically coerced into assimilation. It's not like, hey, you should join us because this is great. It's more like you have to join us because we say so. You know what I mean?
Well, if they're going to pick a culture value, like if they're going to pick a culture to tie their history thousands of years to, create this strong Chinese unit, this strong Chinese state with like a really long history, then they're kind of forced to pick the Han as that unifying factor because that's the majority of the population.
Right, of course.
And Han has been a name for so long. I mean, I feel like they're just kind of forced to do that. But I think when he says they have an ability to exert unity, I think that kind of means that they're like a continuous presence in China that everyone can relate to or sympathize to.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not finding the right words.
Depends on who you ask, right? Because again, this, if you ask a Uyghur, they don't sympathize with Han in that respect. They don't identify as Han. They see them as competitors, even. And there's a lot of differences here. I mean, like the Uyghurs specifically are in these re-education camps, as we spoke about in the last episode, and they're basically taught by force how to be good communists and how to learn Mandarin Chinese, right? And these are like core tenets of these re-educations that they are forced to go through, and I think the language part doesn't fall on deaf ears for me, to pun intended here. Professor Fay basically refers to what he calls the common Han language. And I think what he means, this is again back in the 80s, but what he means there is like Mandarin or Cantonese or both. But I actually do think it's useful to think of this language difference as a Han language, because it makes it easier to separate from other languages that the minorities speak. But from the perspective of that like language there, only a couple of ethnic groups, for example, the Hui, they have adopted the Han language as their own language. And you could also say that pretty much every ethnic minority has their own language in China. But it gets kind of complicated, right? So there's this group called the Manchus, who are considered one of those 55 ethnic minorities who, it'd be hard for you to find a Manchu who can actually speak Manchu, let alone who can read or write in Manchu. So like that language is pretty much gone, and they use the Han language, in their day-to-day lives. But there are 10 ethnicities specifically that have their own straight up writing system. But even within them, only a few of them are widely used. So a few of them off the top of my head here are like Tibetan for sure, Mongolian, which by the way exists within China and outside China, Uyghur, of course, and even Korean. There's a good Korean population and Korean speaking people in China as well. But most of these ethnic minorities, they've been in contact with the Han, and ultimately, if you come into contact with the Han over the course of these last 2,000 years, you're probably going to learn the Han language because it was useful, right? Like, as you pointed out, they've been sticking around for thousands of years. So, like, they're consistent. They're the people you're going to trade with. They're the people you're going to do business with. They're sometimes the people that you're going to go to war with,
I wonder.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder. I didn't want to interrupt you, but to go back to Manchu, I don't want to forget this.
Yeah,
Manchus.
Yeah.
So when the Japanese invaded China in the 1930s, they set up a state. They invaded North China first, and they carved out a state as part of Japan, and they called it Manchukuo.
Right.
And that's where the Manchu, like the original origin of the Manchus, were. Japanese were doing a lot of fucked up shit.
Yeah, they really did.
The Chinese people. A lot of. I wonder what was. I don't know this. I'm just asking like an open question. I wonder what was the impact on
the Manchu culture.
The Manchu cultures from that. Was there like any type of mass migration out, forced assimilation? Like
that was a long time ago. Well, not really that long, but it was a decent amount of time ago, and that might have caused, or at least furthered, the demise of the use of the Manchu language in daily life. That definitely did not help, in my opinion. I'm not a scholar on this particular.
During the Second Sino-Japanese War, during World War II, or prior to them bombing Pearl Harbor, there was a mass migration of Chinese people from the East Coast into the Western land. Like probably one of the largest human migrations ever to take place. Just because the Japanese were ravaging cities. They were destroying cities. They were... I did a lot of work on the rape of Nanking.
Right, yeah. That was terrible.
There's enough evidence to really suggest that the Japanese were engaging in, they were incentivizing the killing of civilians among individual soldiers.
Yeah.
There's newspaper articles with guys with scores. Like, this guy killed 130 people with a sword. Like, just really
disgusting,
weird, bizarre things.
Yeah, for sure.
But
I mean, I can't imagine that to kind of wrap up on the Manchus. Like, I can't imagine that the Japanese invasion there, that it didn't help the Manchu language, and to kind of wrap up this bit on language, I think there's not a ton of research on this specific issue, but the Han language has gradually become the common language in all of China, right? Even though there are so many different types of languages that are used, there's one language, the Han language, or I guess 2 languages if you want to count Mandarin and Cantonese, that are pervasive throughout, the Chinese mainland. Here's one. Here's the Communist Party line here again. Quote from Professor Fay: "After liberation, the policy of the people's government was to give the right to each minority to use their own spoken and written languages, which was inscribed in the Constitution." So, again, we're looking at this 30 years on, but while it might have been inscribed in the Constitution, the right for each minority to use their own language, we see today the Chinese Communist Party using re-education camps to force Uyghurs to learn Han Chinese. Right? Like, stop using Uyghur. You must use Han Chinese instead. So it's all ironic. It's sad and it's ironic. And it's not happening 3,000 years ago. It's happening now. For all of this, I just wonder out loud, and this could honestly be its own show. I wonder to what extent, Emperor Qin Shi Huang, his accomplishments in unifying the Chinese language and the writing system, I wonder how much of that is being used as a template today in the Chinese Communist Party to basically force assimilate, or you can say erase, ethnic minority culture, specifically language. That's just kind of an open question.
Well, I think I said this in the last episode. What's taking place in China is China's going through the nation state building process, but they're doing it with a blunt hammer in front of the world.
Right.
So
on TikTok.
It looks on TikTok. It's disturbing to look outside in when you're like, oh yeah, there's a camp with barbed wire surrounding it, and that's where they're being re-educated.
Yeah.
Very, very weird stuff.
Very weird.
Now, genocide, I don't think they're not mass killing people. That's usually what a genocide is classified as.
I guess so.
When you say the word genocide, you think of like taking a bunch of people into the middle of the desert and leaving them and then letting them die, like the Armenian. Like the Armenian genocide was largely like
or like the Rwandan genocide
where left them there.
Or like the Rwandan genocide where, a group of, what was it, Houthis, came to kill all the Tutsis with, machetes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a genocide. I think if we're arguing semantics, you might
say
be right.
Culture genocide.
Yeah, culture genocide, sure.
Culture genocide is for sure.
If what we've learned about forced sterilizations is true, I would say that this is a proxy genocide in the sense that while we're not killing you today, we're making sure that you don't have children.
We're not trying to kill you. We're trying to destroy your culture.
Right. We're trying to make sure that your culture doesn't continue, which is kind of itself a bit of a genocide. I don't want to get bogged down on this. We had a whole fucking episode on that. So if you're interested in that, go listen to the last one.
It makes perfect sense though, knowing what like the Chinese state system is, and how would you expect them to confront a religion they see as foreign and a minority that they see has a perplexity to react violently when provoked?
I mean, well, understanding how the Han culture generally integrates other ethnic minorities is pretty hard because there's a lot of different iterations of it over the last few thousand years. But, a lot of it are sometimes minorities integrate for societal reasons, right? Like it's just, they like the Han, right? So they just join. Sometimes it's economic, right? Actually, most of the time I'd argue it's economic, right? The Han did agriculture really fucking well, right? So we want to live in a prosperous land. Sure, yeah, we'll be Han. That sounds good. A lot of the time, though, it is political, right? And I think if you look at all of the dynasties, all of them have, and even local governments, not just like federal government style dynasties, even the like local governments had a playbook for how to deal with inter-ethnic relations, right? There were some rulers who who were from ethnic minorities that were ethnic minorities themselves, like Shanbei of the Northern Wei, who basically they used reward systems or sometimes like administrative things to make their people assimilate with the Han. So they'd be like, hey, this is better for you if you start speaking Han and acting like a Han and, adopting Han culture, because look at all this money we're making, right? Like they literally used administrative means and sometimes rewards. Like, here, if you speak Han, we'll give you land, But there were some rulers, and I think the majority of the rulers who came from minority origins, they ended up trying to suppress the Han, right? They wanted to maintain their own ethnic culture. The majority of them were largely unsuccessful, and they ended up assimilating anyway, which is clear because the Han is basically the minority group here. Here's another one of those party line quotes. Indeed, a few decades ago, this is pre-Communist Party, the Republic of China forced the Miao in Guizhou to modify their hairstyles.
Oh, yes.
However, the effects of this kind of direct political intervention are not durable, because this type of political institutional discrimination and oppression will incite strong resistance of the people and greater ethnic consciousness, creating more distance within the nation. So, again,
where is this quote from?
This is from Professor Fay. He wrote this. He wrote this about the Miao people in Guizhou, and he was basically dissing the Republic of China, right? And he was saying, well, like, in the Republic of China, they forced these Miao people to change their hairstyle, and that's bad because that's oppression, and it causes, like, resistance. And again, we're looking at this 30 years on, and I'm like just kind of lolling on the side because it didn't age well. Like the Uyghur camps were literally trying to, I don't want to make this all about the Uyghurs, but it's just like comparing and contrasting here. They're making people cut their beards off, like they're making them change, not wear hijab, things like that, It's just, it's funny because he is definitely toting the Communist Party line here, and this is the official Communist Party like theory and ideology, and it's like just totally opposite of what they're doing.
Was he referring to like China as a state prior to the CPP, or is he talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because Taiwan's also called the Republic of China.
Right. That part gets a little confusing. So he's talking about. He's writing from the context of the CCP, right? He is in the Communist Party, and he's dissing the prior government, which was the Republic of China, when they forced the people of the Miao people in Guizhou to change their hairstyle, right? And he's saying that was bad because that's, he's like, that's not the right thing to do. That's not the communist thing to do, it's just, I don't know. It's ironic.
It is very ironic. Hey, forced assimilation is a bitch. You start doing things that you didn't expect yourself to do.
Right. And I'm making a lot of these comparisons to like forced assimilation, but honestly, if I'm being fair, especially over the last 3,000 years, not all of it was forced, right? Like a lot of it was people assimilating willingly.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of it.
People are going to assimilate to cultures that will benefit them.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look at this country. People come to this country all the time to find a better life, and then they assimilate to our culture, right?
Yeah, people assimilate. People come to this country all the time, and they won't speak a word of English, and then their kids will be the most like basic ass, fucking lame ass American privileged fucker ever.
Yeah.
Like, oh, Dad, I want to put on SpongeBob. So yeah, and people will assimilate to whatever culture that will ultimately provide them with the means to just thrive and work and make money and do commerce with people.
Totally, and I think this makes sense to think about, like, how is it that all of these ethnic minorities from the last 2,000 years decided to so effectively absorb into the Han culture? And I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head here. You can argue that these ethnic minorities over the last couple thousand years saw the Han people as this like consistent growing force, right? And that they would either want to directly get in on the action, or they would indirectly assimilate through like mixing, right? Like sometimes this would be the case where I might be a staunch fucking Hui, but my son married a Han girl, and their kids ended up taking on the Han culture, and I might still be Hui, but that intermixing and stuff like that definitely plays a big part in it as well. One good reason, though, to explain this like Han stability is definitely that the agricultural like economy that the Han created. This makes total sense, I think, when you think about how pretty much all of the ethnic minorities, in the regions that were hospitable for agriculture, they all became Han eventually, right? Whereas if you look at the plateaus and the mountains and the steppes and shit, they're still kind of doing their own thing. Why? Well, because you can't plant like a rice farm on the side of a mountain or in a desert, right? Duh. So the people that are in these places where farming is possible, they look at the Han people and they're thinking to themselves like, hey, we can farm here too. Can you show us how you got rich? Like, well, I want to do that, So that's kind of like the positive way of looking at how consistently, the Han the minorities joined the Han culture. But the negative way to look at it would be to say that the Han dynasties, and I'm not talking specifically about the Han dynasty, which is a dynasty. I'm just talking about Han people and the dynasties that they created. The Han dynasties, they dominated places that they could set up an agricultural based economy. If I can plant fucking crops in your land, I'm coming after you, right? That was the edict of Qin Shi Huang, of Emperor Qin was like, if I can plant shit there, I'm taking your land, and you're gonna be Han, and you're gonna like it. God damn it. And so that sparks. If we look at the global perspective, right, we see other ancient empires, right, like Akkad is an example, right, as they grow, their population grows, right, and their need for land and more food production increases with it, and this causes war and tension, and warring periods followed by peaceful periods followed by warring periods, and the cycle goes on and on and on. And if you look at the historical records, specifically in China, of the warring periods, we have all of these things happening. And I think this is probably more true than the fear of missing out argument that Professor Fay is trying to make, where like, oh, people just wanted to join it because it was great. I probably think is, probably had something to do with the way that empires expand.
But I guess regardless, it was just tied up into the agriculture,
right,
and the land that still lasts today,
right.
But this had to be a big problem going into the 19th and 20th century when they started going toe to toe with European industrial societies that were just a lot more advanced by the time they really made that contact with them.
Sure.
Suddenly nations with a significantly smaller population could produce crops and more agriculture and products,
right,
without as much labor.
Mm-hmm.
And China was kind of China was put in a position where they had to play catch up with the rest of the world. And in the 1800s, you see Japan and China. Japan is given the opportunity for industrialization right away, and they take it, and China doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And Japan ends up dominating Asia for a good, doesn't last that long, probably about 40 years.
But still.
Not even 40 years. They started dominating Asia after the Russo-Japanese War.
But even 40 years, in the industrial period is worth like 400 years in the period prior.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because Japan ended up,
how much progress they make in such a short span of time,
Well, the progress that Japan makes from the period where Commodore Perry shows up in Japan with the black ships,
gunboat diplomacy,
and says, "Hey, like you're gonna trade with us, or we're gonna," because Japan was an isolationist society at that time,
right,
and they were like, "Hey, you're gonna trade with us, and you're gonna fucking like it," and they're like,
gonna
"No,
blow
we're
your
not."
ass out.
They're like, "We're gonna," and they started blowing up shit, and they're like, "All right, we'll do it." They're like, and then they go back and like, "Hey, these guys have these fucking ships that could just level anything that we have on the coast.
Right.
We cannot go to war with them. We'll lose."
Right.
They're like, all right, well, why don't we just like trade with them and get their guns? Because they already had guns and stuff. They were trading with the Portuguese and then.
Well, I mean, famously, gunpowder was invented in the Tang Dynasty by China, which is crazy that it took off so much harder in other places in the world.
It's very strange that happened. That gunpowder was created in China, but it was the evolution of like muskets and firearms and rifles really took place in Europe and in America. Yeah, really is when you see the major developments in guns. It's like through the Civil War. But yeah, it ended up screwing them when they had to engage with these with like England that really had no interest other than dividing them up and hooking them up, forcing them to purchase opium.
Yeah, that was fucked up. Yeah, that was
really
fucked up.
Kind of. And they had a lot of screwed up leaders too, who were really corrupt at that period of time, who were more salesmen than leaders.
Well, go figure.
That's kind of
par for the course for authoritarian, societies. So.
Yeah.
I mean, we're coming pretty long here. So I want to wrap with a few more, thoughts on Chinese demographics now that we know a bunch about it. So I think I really like this essay. I think Professor Fay does a really awesome job of doing history, and I'm barely scratching the surface here, talking to you guys about this. But I also think that since it was written in the 80s, a lot of these numbers are outdated, and even some of the ideas are a little bit outdated, but the general gist of the distribution of population, for the ethnic minorities versus the Han is pretty much the same. And he goes at length to group all of these Han people together as a single ethnicity. And I think he's making the point that that this would make them the single largest ethnicity in the world. And I kind of contest a bit because I contest this a bit because this wouldn't be true for India as an example, right? India has a roughly equal number of people, but more, if I'm not mistaken, by a little bit, right? It's in the billions, right? So who cares? It's close enough. And they also have a pretty similar geographic boundary set, right? They have the Himalayas and the seas and the Indian Ocean, things like that, and they also have a ton of distinct ethnic groups, but Indians don't have like this convenient construct of being, quote, Indian. Like I'm calling them Indian because it's easy to say, but they don't have the same thing, right? Like a Hindu person identifies as Hindu and Gujarati people identify as Gujarati and so on and so forth. China has this national identity that is both, and this is the crazy part, it is both a constructed fiction, like it's not real, it's just this fiction that everyone believes, but it's also a practical reality because of all the assimilation that happens and that has been happening over the last couple thousand years. He also makes some questionable claims about some ethnic minorities, and this one kind of got under my skin a bit. Specifically, he was talking about these ethnic minorities who maybe at one point might have been Han, but today they don't identify as Han, and so he brings up some fossil records and some historical migratory patterns, But he basically refers to them as an unidentified ethnicity instead of the ethnicity that they want to call themselves. You know, I have a quote from it, but I really don't even need to read it. You know, the point is that they have these ethnicities that at one point might have been Han, and now they don't consider themselves Han. And I think he's kind of, I might be setting up a false choice here, but as it relates to minorities who might have been descended from Han, but who no longer identify as it, like, which is it? You know, because Faye makes the argument that in order to become an ethnicity, a community needs to recognize members outside of their community in order to distinguish themselves as an ethnicity. Right? So I think he writes, it must be noted that in order for an ethnicity to be named, it must first exist as an ethnicity and does not become an ethnicity until it has been named. Right? So it's this kind of like a chicken and the egg situation, right? In order to be an ethnicity, you need to all agree that you're an ethnicity, but in order for you to agree that you're an ethnicity, you need to know that some other ethnicity exists outside of your ethnicity first. You know? It's nuts. And for these specific ethnic identification of these unidentified ethnicities, I see this as an attempt to basically exercise this kind of cult-like unified national identity of China, right? Like, for me, and this hits home for me, I think, because I'm an American, and for those who've been listening to the show for a while, you probably already know that I'm half Puerto Rican and half Palestinian, and that's where my heritage comes from. But
your nationality,
right. That's my nationality, right? Or I don't know. Like, I hate these labels because it's like unclear for me. If you were to ask me, right, if anywhere in the world I go, if people ask me, what am I, right? I identify as an American, right? That's what I identify as. That is the culture that I share, right? And that would be like me going up to, you know, a French person in France, and they ask me, you know, what's your ethnicity? And I say, oh, I'm an American. And they tell me, no, you're not. You're either a Puerto Rican or a Palestinian. Or worse, they said, oh, you must be other than. Okay, I know what you are. You know, it's like I am what I identify as. And I happen to identify as an American, you know? And like, who the fuck are you to tell me what I identify as or not? Like I think what's important here for me is that ethnicity is entirely a social construct. Something that, you know, and I'm borrowing from Faye here, it, quote, undergoes changes over the course of history. So even though in some cases we have these biological pretexts to ethnicity, those biological pretexts by themselves are not what make ethnicity, and they're certainly not what keep an ethnicity that way. Right?
Well, you know, a lot of the ethno kind of alt-writers, they kind of harp on this subject, like, oh, we need to make an ethno state.
Yeah.
The more you kind of read into, like, ethnicities and stuff, the more you find out that race matters less and less.
Yep.
Between people.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily talking about ethnicity. They're talking about more so like race, like
race
DNA,
theory,
like genetics,
right, exactly, right.
Like race theory. Mm-hmm. The more you, I don't understand really how. I do understand that they come to those conclusions, but I just think they're just wrong.
Yes.
Not even just on a moral level, but
just like on a practical level,
on an intellectual level. I think that a lot of they're just the ideas are dumb. The ethnicities are fleeting. Mm-hmm. Like they're totally fleeting things. Right. Like they're never going to stay the same, and they're always going to change continuously. Mm-hmm. One day this will be different. I mean, it's hard to say now because there's so much like shit out there. There's so much like written English out in the world right now. It's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine in the future there being another language that like the dominant Earth culture speaks. But I guess
it might be Chinese. It might be the Han language.
That would be amazing, right?
Well, I mean, that seems like the practical way to go, right? Because, you know, the reason why English today is the dominant, global language is because it has the most economic backing to it. And in the next, 5 years, China's going to surpass us as the global leader in the economy. Does that mean that in the next 5 years, we're all going to be speaking Chinese? Hell no, right? Because it doesn't happen that fast. Like cultural changes don't shift overnight. But if it sustains that way, and the Chinese government doesn't implode on itself, right? Then the likelihood is that if they continue to be the economic powerhouse in the world for a couple decades, then yeah, people are going to naturally assimilate to Chinese. They're going to assimilate to the Han. And
when aliens come to Earth, the big question is who's going to be, of what language are we going to speak to them? Diplomats going to speak to them?
Math. We're not going to speak to them in language. Math is a universal language.
Hey, math is just a social construct, man.
No, it's not.
Math is a social construct.
I want to kind of end here with one thought. So we were talking about how the economy of the Han Chinese people was agricultural based, and eventually because of the Industrial Revolution they had to change that up. But I mean, up until very recently, it's still, even today, you might argue that it's still very agriculturally dominant. But if you look at their future plans, right, and their China Road, One Belt Initiative, whatever the fuck it's called, the land bridge.
One Belt, One Road.
Yeah, One Belt, One Road. If you look at that, what's interesting is all of the places that historically the Han people over the last 2,000, 3,000 years ignored, the steppes, the mountains, all those places, are now all the places that are rich in all of the things that a modern economy needs. Minerals, oil, natural gases, and now they're very interested in those regions that they used to ignore, So I find that it's like super interesting, and now, I see this as mostly, like, I see this conflict as mostly economically driven, and not, I don't want to put down Han people and say that they're all like Han supremacists and all this other nonsense. Like, I think this is mostly an economic problem, right? So there's that.
Well, I mean, China's very energy dependent on the Middle East.
Oh yeah.
So they are they're very, very thirsty for energy. Mm-hmm. So finding natural resources in a region where there's people who are not with it yet.
Yep.
Or not down yet with like what we're doing here in the state.
Not down with the Han-ness.
See, I think it's more so just, I don't think so. Mao, for example, the bastard that he was, I think he rejected Han nationalism. From things I've read, mm-hmm. He was more focused on like, the communist state and that ideology.
Right.
And he rejected like the construct that the Han were this the core of Chinese culture.
Yeah, I mean that's evidenced in their.
And Xi Jinping, I think he's kind of said similar things, but at the end of the day, it's like 90% of the population, and it's still part of the state. If that's what 90% of your population
the practical reality
is,
right?
Yeah, it's the practical reality of it.
Yeah, totally.
I know it's a weird, touchy topic, right?
Yeah, that is true. Because Mao founded the Communist Party, and in their constitution, it does talk. I read one quote there that talks about like that. Ethnic minorities should be able to have their own language, but also there's some parts in there that I left out of this particular thing here that talks about how ethnic minorities should get preferential treatment, right? That they should even get a leg up on society, and the reason why is because oh man, I wish I can find this super quickly, but that the Communist Party wants everyone to have a equal playing field, and that they should all get this extra special treatment, even if it means, not equality but equity. You know what I mean? Where these ethnic minorities who aren't quite as advanced should get extra money or extra education, things like that. And it's funny because that's in their founding documents, and they are definitely against a classist society, right? Communism as a political theory is opposed to the idea of a Han, like a Han supremacist,
as a racial supremacy group,
exactly,
or like a racial class,
right.
Really.
Right.
They don't believe in classes.
That's not a thing. All that there is the state. But like you pointed out, 90% of their state is Han. So the state is Han.
It's certainly a very touchy subject,
yeah.
And
yeah.
I'm glad we decided to speak about ethnicity and culture using China as a template, because I feel like that's less sensitive than talking about other stuff. Like using another template.
Yeah, totally.
But man, I learned a lot from this conversation.
Oh, good.
It is really interesting. I'm also confused as well, but I think that's a good thing, right?
Probably.
I have so many questions in my head. So I think this was productive. I hope you all have the same feeling as being like, oh, I learned a lot about China today, but also feeling very confused at the same time. Be like, I have some questions about all this stuff. That's certainly how I feel. But no, this was great. I think that this was incredibly informative for me, at the very least. Man, I definitely learned a lot from doing this show today. Are we going to end this right here?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, for joining us for another episode of Bro History. We always really appreciate it when you join us for an hour and a half during the week. We just appreciate your time that you give us and your attention. So thanks again. If you want to support us, there are two ways to do that. Number one, you rate and review the podcast if you have an Apple device. So just click on the 5-star thingy, write a review. We've been getting a lot of reviews lately, so we really do appreciate it. Continue writing the reviews. It helps us grow. We see significant correlation between the reviews that we get and the ratings that we get, and then the number of downloads. So it really helps the show grow. So just keep on doing that. And if you want to get like more episodes, so we do after shows that we do like a 30-minute to 15-minute kind of shooting the shit recap, talking about maybe more current event topics. It's really talking about extending the show a little bit longer. So we release that on our Patreon. So you can sub to our Patreon for just as low as $1 a month. You also get access to our Slack account. The Slack account is it's like a centralized hub where we all communicate. So a lot of our listeners will talk to each other. We have listeners from all over the world who are in there. We have some really fun conversations going on. So you can join us on Slack if you go to Patreon/Bro History. It's late. We do these shows very late on weekdays because we love you guys so much. All right, that's everything I had to say.
Yep. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy Chinese New Year.
Peace.
Peace.